Okay. Hi, Dr. Ruba. I'm going to give your introduction and then I'll turn it over to you. Dr. Ashley Ruba earned her PhD in developmental psychology at the University of Washington, where she studied the development of emotion perception in early childhood. In 2022, she left her NIH postdoctoral fellowship to pursue a career as a UX researcher. She currently works as a human factors engineer at Arthrex, developing digital technologies to assist with orthopedic surgery. She also writes about non-academic careers for over 70,000 followers on social media. I know some of us were already talking about how we follow you. So we're so excited to have you here with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Um, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, I'll be
Yeah,
monitoring the chat so I can keep an eye on that if there are questions in the chat or questions in the room here.
cool. Um, yeah, can everyone see that?
Yes, we can.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah, so today I'm going to be, and thank you for that introduction, but today I'm going to be talking about interviewing in industry. And interviewing there's some similarities, but ultimately a lot of differences between interviewing in industry and interviewing for non-academic roles. But ultimately, what I hope that all of you will learn today is why companies hire people and why companies conduct interviews. I hope that you can be able to compare the two different types of interview questions that are commonly asked, that you'll be able to create brief structured answers to common interview questions, understand and list the steps to a non-academic job interview, and understand how best to prepare for an interview. So it's important to think about, why do companies hire? And this maybe seems like a weird question, but it's really important to understand that companies hire people to solve business problems. And the typical business problem that companies are trying to solve is, how do we increase revenue? How do we make more money? So when you're interviewing and when you're applying for jobs, you really want to think about what you can give the company rather than what the company can give you. It's all about how you can create value, how you can increase revenue, improve efficiency. And that's what you're trying to communicate in your resume, in your interviews, and throughout the job application process. You hear this a lot, this idea that I just need someone to give me a chance because I don't have experience. But ultimately, companies, and this is going to sound maybe weird and harsh, but companies don't exist to give you a chance. You need to show people how you are qualified for a particular job, because ultimately, at the end of the day, hiring is a really big risk. And the goal of interviews is to reduce that risk. You can imagine that you don't want to hire someone who doesn't have the skills to deliver value without minimum training. So if you hire someone and you need to spend months training them how to do their job, the company is losing money. You also don't want to hire someone who's just going to leave in a few months. So you want to hire someone who, you think they can stay at the company for long term, you think they have the ability to develop and grow into their role. And ultimately, you want to hire someone who you like working with. So the goals of interviews to answer these questions, to make sure when you're giving someone an offer, they have the skills, they don't need a ton of training, they'll stay at your company, and you'll like working with them. So there are two different types of interview questions that get commonly asked. The first one are technical questions, and this is assessing, does this person have the skill for a particular role? And so common technical questions include, how much experience do you have managing teams, or writing research proposals, or using a particular method, whatever is relevant for that particular job. You might be asked to describe a qualitative study that you've done. This was a question I got asked during my interviews at Meta. Describe a quantitative study that you've done, describe a qualitative study that you've done. And this, again, is assessing that you have the skills to do your job. And then you might be asked, what is your experience working with software or a particular method or something that's very specific to that role. Again, this is really just trying to assess that this person has the skills, like the required basic minimum requirement skills to succeed at their job. And there are, every job post is kind of a wish list. So there's some things that you absolutely have to have, and there's some things that are just kind of a nice to have. But these are really assessing that the person has like the basic level things that you need to do your job well. The other type of interview questions are behavioral questions, and these are mostly to assess, will I enjoy working with this person? what is it like to work with this person? And this is the part that really trips people up because people don't prepare for these beforehand a lot of the times. So some behavioral questions that I've been asked include, tell me about a time that you've had a conflict with a manager. What's your greatest strength and weakness? Tell me about a time when you saved the day. These are all questions that I've been asked in interviews. And there's a very specific way to prepare for these questions and to answer them, because you need to be able to prepare for them, because you can imagine someone asking you, what's your greatest weakness? And your answer, you don't want to mess this up because you're ultimately answering something like bad about yourself, but there's a specific way to spin this to where it doesn't sound like super bad. And you hear the STAR format is the way that people suggest that you frame these behavioral questions. So, one question I was asked, tell me about a time when you faced a difficult problem at work. And so STAR stands for situation, task, action, and result. So the S, the situation, when I answered this question was, I started piloting my first research project as a postdoc when COVID-19 shut down my university and all of my research. And so the task at hand then was I had to decide and figure out how to continue data collection now that we couldn't test people in person. A is the action. So what did I do? I pivoted to online data collection. I taught myself a programming language to rebuild my study from the ground up. And then the result was our study restarted. We actually had a significantly faster data collection rate, and I was able to finish piloting. So you can Google behavioral interview questions. There's so many that get asked over and over again in these interviews, and just start thinking of specific examples that you can draw from your own work to answer these questions and to have a very concise story. Interviews, a lot of the time, it's just about telling a story and doing it succinctly and not rambling. And this leads me to big mistakes that I see people make when they're doing interviews. And I'm someone who I think I interview pretty well. Whenever I've gotten to like the first round of an interview, I've typically always gotten to the very end. So one mistake that you can make, especially when you're pivoting from a different career and from academia, is just talking too much about academia and really focusing on why you're leaving and all of the bad things, because there's two problems with this. One is that most employers don't really know about academia and they don't really care. And, if you can view this as it is like a really big pivot, it can feel like identity loss. And, there's a lot of things that I didn't like about academia that I was leaving behind. But whenever I talk to people and I ask them, like, how much do you know about academia and academic hiring? Their answer is, I don't really know anything, like, at all. So a lot of people don't really understand like this weird bubble that we're in. So I wouldn't talk too much about that and why you're leaving and making it into a big deal. And so just stay positive and forward thinking and really think about why you want to work at a particular company. So when I pivoted from my psych postdoc into a UX research position, and people were asking, why are you wanting to work here? Like, why did you apply here? My answer was really focused on the positives of UX research. So I said things like, I really want to work in a collaborative environment on a fast-paced team where I have a really clear impact for my work, which is very different than saying, well, in academia, everything's really slow and you're siloed and you don't really have support, and you publish papers and then no one reads them. It's a very different framing. So staying positive and not talking about your previous employer is general, like, good interview advice. The other big interview mistake I see is, and this is for, resumes, LinkedIn, everything, is just focusing way too much on what you studied and not how you studied it. And so my PhD, developmental psych, I studied babies for 10 years. No one really cares. No one really cares about that. I'm at a medical device company. And then before that, I was at Meta, and I was never hired because I'm an expert in infant emotion perception, like this very niche area. I was hired because of my skills. And that's the big thing to keep in mind through this whole process, is companies are hiring you for your skills, not your subject matter expertise, and not for your degree. Like, your degree is more just this checkbox that you have to hit on most job applications. But at the end of the day, I was hired because of my research skills, because of my communication skills, my writing skills, my ability to work with teams. I was not hired because I studied babies for 10 years. And so I see PhDs, even on resumes, getting way too in the weeds about, the results that they found in their niche research area. But unless you're pivoting into a place where you can actually study that thing, it really doesn't matter. And then rambling answers, this is what I hit on before. And this is why it's really important to rehearse your answers to common questions, doing mock interviews. Another question I see people rambling on, and it's the question that's always asked in interviews, is tell me about yourself. And you can prepare a very succinct, like 60-second spiel about yourself and your journey, but you ultimately don't want to just ramble for 5 minutes about your career. So just be as brief as possible. And then lack of confidence is just the big thing that I notice, even with, like, I coach a lot of PhDs and I chat with a lot of PhDs on social media, and I see this all the time. And it's very sad because you have to believe that you would be a great asset for the company. Like, you have to sell yourself. If you don't sell yourself, no one else is going to do it. And at the end of the day, it's not the most qualified person that always gets the job. It's the person who convinces the company that they are the most qualified person. And so you really have to believe this. And there's not really like an easy trick for this. It's really just a mindset shift. And, I see this with PhDs thinking that they're overqualified or underqualified, or they don't believe in themselves. But at the end of the day, it's really about confidence. And another thing to think about, because you do have value, like every single person who I'm talking to has value. And one thing that I encourage people to think about is this unique value proposition. And so you see this a lot with products. Whenever a product comes on the market, they want to be able to solve a particular problem in a way that's unique to them. And so you can do this as well, because at the end of the day, in an interview, you're not selling a product, but you're selling yourself. So if you think about, I help X do Y by Z, for me as a career coach, I help PhDs launch fulfilling non-academic careers through career strategy and mentorship. Like, that is my unique value proposition. And for my job, I help de-risk medical devices by conducting usability research. And so for each of you, you can think about, what career are you targeting? What is the thing that you do really well? And like, how can you help that company ultimately? I encourage people to just throw this in their LinkedIn headline. You see that a lot in a lot of LinkedIn headlines, and it's a pretty memorable thing when you see it. So in terms of interview steps, it's going to vary pretty widely by company and by role. And I've gone through many different interview processes. Some of them had 5 different steps that took over like 4 months. Some of them, it was a 2-month thing that only had 3 steps, but typically you see the same things over and over again. The first one is a phone screen. So usually it's a 30-minute phone or Zoom screen with HR or recruiter. And so this is after you submit your resume, after you apply online. And I'll go through each of these in more detail. After the screen, then usually there's an initial interview, which is usually a Zoom meeting, 30 to 60 minutes with the hiring manager. And the hiring manager is the person who's ultimately has the power to hire you at the end of the day. They're the one making the final decision. Then you have all these additional steps, and it can really vary, again, depending on the company and the role. I've had take-home assignments. I've had technical screens and coding interviews for more quantitative-based positions. I've also had additional Zoom interviews with team members or people on other teams who I'd work with. So again, and then I've also had interviews where I didn't have any of this, and it just went from, at Meta, it's actually just a phone screen, an initial interview, and then you go to the loop, the final interview loop. And this is the all-day thing. They've ranged anywhere from 4 hours to 8 hours, usually in person. I've had a couple of loops for remote jobs that were over Zoom, but usually this is a series of interviews. It feels very similar to grad school. It's very exhausting, and 36-minute interviews. Sometimes it's the same people you met before and different people. And then I've also done, I've done presentations. I've had my last interview for my current job. I was like, oh, I'll have a lunch break. And then I got lunch with the hiring manager, who's my manager. And I was like, oh, I have to be like on during lunch. And it was very reminiscent of my grad school interviews, where you're just kind of like on all day. So just preparing for the exhaustion of that, because I forgot what that felt like. And like I said, this whole process, all of the jobs I've had 3 outside of academia now, and those processes were pretty quick, like usually about 2 months, but I've had one that I think would have dragged on to like 4 more months. And you just don't really know. It kind of just depends on scheduling and stuff. Or the phone screen. So like I said, this is the initial thing. So if someone's read your resume, they've determined based on your resume that you meet some minimum qualification for this job, and the HR recruiter wants to talk to you further. So at this point, they're really just gathering more information, making sure that you meet the basic requirements for a job before they pass you on to the hiring manager. Usually it's a lot of technical questions, really trying to assess your experience and your prior experience. Sometimes I've had some behavioral questions be asked. At my very first job, I feel like a part of this initial screen really felt like a vibe check, like would this person like fit in our company culture? And that was at a company that was 100 people. So I think they cared a little bit more about like only wanting to pass people on who kind of fit with the personality or culture of that company. But ultimately, the goal is to figure out whether this person's suitable to pass on to the hiring manager. The hiring manager is a full-time employee. They're usually really busy. And so if you have, hundreds of people applying for a job, you're screening, 20% of them. You only want to pass on the most qualified people to the hiring manager because you don't want to waste their time. What are your salary expectations? And I have a whole slide on this next because you're usually going to be asked this question in the first phone screen. And this is also a place where you can get really tripped up, especially when you're pivoting out of academia, because I've never been asked this question. I've just accepted like whatever salary was given to me. But there is a way to answer this question. And ultimately, you don't want to give a direct answer. And so why don't you want to give a direct answer? Well, if you say too low, employers are going to hold you to that number. Like they will want to pay you, like, unless you have like a really good recruiter or a hiring manager who's just like, no, you're worth more than that. Like some employers will hold you to that number, and then you won't be able to negotiate later. If you give a number that's too high, employers might think you're too expensive or you're overqualified, and they won't move you on because they'll think, well, we can't pay this person this amount of money, so they're ultimately not going to take the job, or they won't stay here for a long period of time. And ultimately, base salary is only part of a package. So there's health insurance and bonuses and 401k and like all of this stuff that I never had to consider as a postdoc. And because at the end of the day, and I share my salary pretty openly, but when I was working at Meta, I was a contractor, I was making 160 grand. I do live in Seattle for context, but I didn't have health insurance or like bonuses or any of these benefits. And I'm currently full-time and my base salary is 110. And on the surface, it seems like a really big pay cut, but I also got a $10,000 signing bonus. I have a 401k with a 6% match. I have a 15% performance bonus that happens annually. So when you add up all of these benefits, it gets pretty close to 160. So this is why you don't want to give a direct answer. So what do you say instead? So my last job interview, I was asked this question, and my answer and the recommended answer is to dodge the question and to ask them instead, like, basically, like, I'd be happy to talk about this later. Or it depends on the total package. And then I usually ask, like, what is the range that you're working for this position? And there are salary transparency laws that are coming up more and more. So like at my last job, they told me what the range was. And I think they said, the range it was a really wide range. It was like, oh, it's anywhere from like 100 to 200. And I was like, okay, well, like based on that, like, and the fact that I'm living in Seattle, I'd be expecting to be making like middle to upper end of that range is what I said. And they were like, yeah, that's fine. You can also say, I'm currently interviewing positions that pay a particular range if they like really press you or you don't feel comfortable providing an answer. Or you can say, I'm currently interviewing positions that pay a minimum amount. For example, if you're really like, no, I need to be making at least this much, then that's also an answer that you can give. But avoid giving a direct answer because like I said, they will hold you to that if you go too low, for sure. So once you get past all of that screen, then you're on to the initial interview. And like I said, this is typically a 60-minute Zoom interview with a hiring manager. And like I said, this is the person who ultimately make the final decision about hiring you. They're typically going to be your manager in the future if you are hired. This has always been, in my last few interviews, this has always been the person who I would be directly reporting to. So their goal is to assess whether you're going to be a good fit for their team. So I've been asked technical questions, I've been asked behavioral questions. It really depends on the company and the role. And I say this because, like I said, at my first company, it was a 100-person company, pretty small. And they asked me a ton of behavioral questions, so many behavioral questions. And when I interviewed at Meta, I don't think they asked me a single behavioral question. It was all technical questions. It was also a lot of case study questions, which I found really challenging to answer in a good way. But I worked at Meta Reality Labs, so they'd be asking me questions about, imagine that we're building a new augmented reality system and we want to add this new feature. Tell me what kind of study you would design in order to test the usability of this feature. And so you're basically coming up with research plans on the spot and walking through the kinds of questions you would ask and the method you would use and the variables that you would test. And so I found that whole process to be really challenging, but like in a good way ultimately. But like I said, I don't think I was asked a single behavioral question at Meta. It was just like all technical questions. So it really depends. And I would look at, I think Glassdoor has a lot of interview reviews. So you can go to Glassdoor, and even like all the big tech companies, like they have lots of people have shared their experiences with these interviews. So you can see for different companies how it goes. And then in this step, like I said, there can be additional steps in between the hiring manager interview and the final loop, and it kind of just depends on your company and your role. I've had take-home assignments and technical screens. I applied for more like quantitative research positions, quantitative behavioral scientist positions, and these take-home assignments were usually, here's some data, analyze it in R and write a report. And so this is really assessing technical skills, whether, you can write or do data analysis. I've also been asked to, design studies for like more writing focused positions. You might have a writing test. And there's also coding interviews that you'll typically see for data analyst or especially data scientist positions where you're doing a live coding interview with someone and they're giving you a problem, and maybe you're actually writing code, maybe you're just whiteboarding how you would solve the problems. I had to do, for one of the quant positions I interviewed for, I had to do a coding interview in R. And it was a mixture of, reading code and being like, what does this code do? And then also reading code and telling like, where are the error, like, why would this throw an error message? And it is hard. I mean, I passed that interview, but like coding interviews in and of itself are a whole thing to prepare for. So just keep that in mind if you want to, especially go into data scientist positions. That is something that you'll have to do. With the take-home assignments, usually you get like 24 to 72 hours to turn them around and give them back. So just something to keep in mind to schedule that when you actually have time. I feel like for all the take-home assignments I've gotten, they were like, oh, this should take like 4 hours. And then it takes 16 hours because you want to do it really well. And I have a lot to say about take-home assignments because I think it's just unpaid labor, and some companies will compensate you, most of them won't. So just keep that in mind. I know some people who, if they're ever asked to do a take-home assignment, they just like flat out refuse. Totally up to you. And then, like I said, you may also have like additional 30 or 60-minute Zoom interviews with other kinds of team members. And again, more technical questions, more behavioral questions. It really just depends. And then if you pass all of this, then you enter the final loop. And like I said, this is an all-day interview, and it can really vary in terms of, whether it's 4 hours or, whether it is all day. It's usually in person, but the first 2 jobs I had, the loop was virtual. And then my most recent job, they flew me out to Florida where my company is, and I did it in person. And, it's a series very similar to grad school interviews, a series of 30 or 60-minute interviews. It's usually you'll meet with a hiring manager again. You might meet with, other people on your team again, some people who you've met with before. And you're kind of just meeting with everyone who you might work with ultimately. And you hear this term like cross-functional teams thrown around a lot. You see it on job ads. And basically that just means people on different teams have different functions from what you do. So I'm an engineer, but I often work with prototypers who are building the software, and I work with product managers who are, kind of the masterminds behind the product that we're building. I work with project managers who are the ones orchestrating all of the different components. I work with people at the director level who are, really into strategy. And then I work with other engineers on my team. But ultimately, you need to be able to, as a researcher, in my role, talk to designers who are not researchers, who do not have experience with statistics or research design, and explain to them, this is why I want to do the study this way, or this is why I did the study this way. And being able to communicate with people who are outside of your area of expertise is really important. And that's part of what they're assessing. And again, more technical questions, more behavioral questions. It really just depends. You may also, there was one final interview where I had to give a presentation. There was one where the first company I worked with, I met with the two founders in like a group interview. You might have more technical screens as well. For the first company, they had me do a typing test, which I thought was really interesting. But it was essentially in that role. And part of the reason I left was it was very entry level, and I was essentially like a glorified undergrad research assistant, but I was getting paid $100,000 a year. But it was a lot of like note taking like during the study. So they just wanted to make sure that people could type fairly quickly. And so kind of to sum all of this up in terms of tips, do your research is probably my biggest tip that I have in terms of even just applying for jobs. So whenever you're applying for jobs, like before you apply, just really read about the company. So you can Google the company. I can give you examples from when I was interviewing at my current role at Arthrex. I Googled the company. I was watching YouTube videos. They have a ton of promotional materials, just really trying to figure out, what do they do? Like, what are they going to be doing? Because you can imagine how not great it would look if you show up to interview at a company and you're just like, I don't really know what you do, but the job sounded interesting. This is really just about going above and beyond and showing that you really care and are enthusiastic about a position. I would also do this with each of your interviewers. So almost everyone has a LinkedIn, but I Google people too. And so for my current role, I actually like connected with the hiring manager on LinkedIn. I can tell that story in a minute, but I searched for him on Google and it came up. He had given a talk that was posted on YouTube about the project that I would be working on. And I watched this hour-long talk where he was talking about the new augmented reality system that they were building. And I like watched that. And then I specifically told him when I met, like, oh, I looked up your talk and I watched it. And I'd actually done this before in another one of my interviews. And in both times, people were just like, oh, wow, you really like looked me up and you really like have a good understanding of what we're doing. And I think that just really stands out because most people don't do that. So I'm all about like going above and beyond and being kind of extra, but it really just shows that you really care and you're really invested and you really want this job at the end of the day. Preparing your own questions is also really important. So at the end of almost every interview, typically they give you 5 or 10 minutes and they say, do you have any questions for me? The worst thing that you can say is, no, I don't have any questions. So you need to be able to prepare your own questions. And so these are some of my favorites. If this hasn't been answered before, just asking like, what is the day-to-day like in this role? Like, what would I be doing? I usually ask, what the size of the structure of the team is, like how many people are in the team? What is the degree of autonomy that I would have? How much am I being told what to do versus I'm the one making the decisions about what to do? It's something that's really important to me because I'm someone who I have a lot of project management experience and I want to be able to lead studies. And that was ultimately a big reason that I left my first job, because I wasn't getting that experience and I wasn't going to be given that experience for a while. So that's why I left for Meta, where they're like, oh yeah, you can totally lead projects. I'm like, great. What are the biggest challenges facing the team is also a really great question to ask people in informational interviews. What are the biggest challenges facing the team or the company? Because that's going to be your job. Like, you're going to have to solve these challenges. And so asking this question shows that you're really thinking about how can you deliver value to the team and the role that you're applying for. And then the question that I always like to end with is, what do you enjoy most about working here? Because it ends on a positive note. feel like everyone loves this question. And you get to see, I've had interviews where a few people are like, oh, I love the people I work with. Like, it's really great. And I mean, you get to see like what people's genuine responses are, and maybe start to suss out a little bit, like, do people maybe not really like working here? Does this kind of suck? You can see like who is really, really enthusiastic about their job. And that's something that I really liked about my company, is everyone genuinely seemed to just like love working there. Above and beyond like any other place that I work, people were like really all about like the mission of the company. And that leads back to my do your research point. I was asked in my last interview for my current job, why do you want to work here? Pretty common question. And my response was, I'd done my research on the company, and I had paid attention to people talking to me, and everyone kept talking about the mission of my company, which is helping surgeons treat their patients better. The ultimate vision is just helping make people better. And I really liked that, and everyone seemed really about it. And so when I was asked that question, that's what I said. And I said, genuinely, like, I really like that this is a mission-driven company. That's something I've really wanted and have looked for. And the person who asked the question told me, he like, that's a really good answer. And I don't think anyone has ever said that before. And I'm like, huh, interesting. But I think it was like really memorable. And again, it's because I did my research, and that's why I was able to have that answer. And then relax, which is really hard because you're like being interviewed and you like want the job. But ultimately, at the end of the day, like I said, people are really assessing, do I want to work with this person? Are they interesting? Are they friendly? And I experienced this before at my last interview, where there were a couple people where I met with, they didn't ask me a single technical question or behavioral question. There's like the director of like the digital technologies team came into my interview. He was like, hey, how's it going? And then we talked for like 15 minutes about, he was like, I see you have a PhD in developmental psychology. And then we talked about how his kid had grown up with, like a developmental disability. And we just like chatted about that for 15 minutes, nothing related to work at all. And it was just totally like a vibe check. And I think he was just like, yeah, this person seems like they have the skills. And it was really just assessing, like, do I like talking to this person? And so I think just like relaxing is useful. And then showing like enthusiasm or passion about your work. And I think in all of this, and I say all of this as someone who is autistic and who has a really hard time making eye contact and being enthusiastic. And I tend to mask, and even I'm like doing this now where I'm like really upregulating like how much emotion I'm showing, because this is not like my default. But like, to the extent that you can really understand that people are looking for people who are really like enthusiastic and passionate, really love their work, like you can make like adjustments to your behavior to show that more, because I think it can really tell when people are just like relaxed and just chatting to you like you're a person, and when people are like really nervous and stiff and are focused on like giving the right answers. So it's a hard thing to do, but I think mock interviews help. So just like practicing with other people, and then ultimately just trying to talk to people as though like they're just a person, they're just like a friend. And but yeah, that is probably like the hardest tip. But I'm also happy to answer questions about any of that, or talk about, like I said, I've interviewed at a bunch of different places, happy to talk about different interviews experiences at different companies. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We have a question already, so I'll pass
Yeah.
that off.
Hi. So yeah, I would like to know a little bit about you said one of the jobs you applied for, they did ask for a presentation.
Yeah.
So since this is not an academic, job talk, it's not academic job talk. So I'm like, what in the world did they ask you to
Yeah.
present on?
Yeah. So this was probably the most academic adjacent position I applied for, which is maybe why they asked for a presentation. But it was at a small, I think they were technically a nonprofit, but they offered me 120 grand a year for a salary. So I was like, I don't know that you're like, it wasn't a nonprofit salary, but it was a small team. It was about 6 people, and very related to the research I did in my PhD and in my postdoc. So it was about developing like emotion assessment, like social and emotional assessments for kids, to ultimately relate that back to like academic achievements and improving that. And so the presentation was partly, presenting some study ideas and presenting my vision for how the things that they were already talking about in their group were related to each other. So it was a very academic presentation. It felt somewhat similar to the job talk I would have given, like going on the academic job market. I also gave a presentation, I'm just remembering this now, for my first job as a UX researcher. And what they asked me to do was they gave me a website and they basically told me to do like a UX teardown of this website. And it was like one of the food ordering apps. I don't remember which one, but it was basically like, imagine you're a user, like what are the big usability issues with this website? And so it was so my presentation was like, here's a profile of the user, me, and here are all of the different like errors or places to improve or like where things could go wrong. I really pointed out that as someone at the time who had like a bunch of food restrictions, it was like really stressful, like navigating this app. And it was like hard to tell like where things were categorized and like what was okay for me to eat and what wasn't okay for me to eat. And that was assessing a few things. One, like, do I understand what UX is and what usability is? But more to the point, I was giving this presentation to, it felt like most of the company, there were like 50 people in the Zoom call. So it was also just like, can I communicate? Can I give a presentation? Can I communicate my findings? So I think that's also what they were assessing in that particular one. But yeah, it's gonna ultimately depend on like the company and the role, but those are the only two that I had to do a presentation for.
I'll ask, what
Mhm.
is the most challenging question that you've had to respond to?
That's a good question. I mean, I think like, what is your greatest weakness is probably the question that trips people up the most, because you have people who give answers like, well, I'm just a perfectionist. I'm like, that's not a good answer. So the answer that I always give is I have a really hard time delegating work to other people because I know that my work, I have a very high bar for the work that I do. And I know that the work that I do is very good. And it's really challenging for me to like give control of that to other people because I don't know that they're going to do it to the same quality that I would do it. But and then this is how you say what your weakness is, but then you also say how you're learning and growing from it. That's the important component of this question. And so then what I usually say is, as a grad student, I was starting in my second year, the only person in my lab. So I was basically doing everything and realized at that point it was not possible for me to do everything by myself. Being a lab manager and like running all of my studies, it just like wasn't possible. So my advisor was actually very reluctant to have like undergraduates be as involved in data collection as I wanted them to be. But I told her, I'm like, I can't do all of this. So I supervised and I trained people and I had to trust people and I gave them feedback. And ultimately that was how I learned to like delegate work. And that's how I was able to, publish as many papers as I did during my PhD. So that's like the hardest question. And I think that's why it's really important to like prepare an answer beforehand. Otherwise you'll say something that either makes you look really bad or you'll say something like, I'm a perfectionist, which is just not really what they're looking for.
Yeah, the way you describe it very much makes it seem like, oh no, okay, like that sounds great.
Yeah.
And then instead
Yeah.
of like,
Yeah.
oh, that's a weakness.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same with like, describe a time you had a conflict with your manager. I mean, I can come up with a bunch of situations that would probably not be like sound great
Yeah.
to share. So this is why it's important to like have these more like negative responses prepared so that you're not like inadvertently making yourself look like really bad. But yeah, I feel like those are the questions that I think are hard to answer if you're not thinking about them beforehand.
Okay, I have two more. What
Yeah.
do you ever like just pivot the question? And so like maybe they ask you about a manager and you didn't prepare that answer, but you prepared it for working with a peer. Do
Yeah.
you ever like pivot that way, or is it like no, you should really stick to whatever the question is, even if you're working off the fly?
Yeah, I mean, I think you just have to stick to what the question is. And I will say, like, that's why it's useful to, it's more, instead of thinking about like specific answers to specific questions, just coming up with stories that could be used to answer like more than one question. Um, so I'm trying to think of like other other ones. So I mean, even like that, the one I had for like greatest weakness, I've used that to answer like, tell me about a time when you were like really overwhelmed at work and how did you handle that? And so I could have used that for that answer as well. So I think that's why it's just good to, come up with like stories and like moments in your career where you had challenges and you overcame them, which could be at various points. And then you can use those to answer more than one question.
We've heard a little bit about informational interviewing. Do you
Mhm.
have any advice for, new graduate students, postdocs who have zero experience in industry? How do you recommend people get the the skills, expertise, knowledge to even be able to apply to these positions?
Yeah. Are you thinking more, I guess, is your question about informational interviews or?
I guess, well, I guess I brought that up in that that's one way to get some of this
Mhm.
information about what
Yeah.
you might need to know. And I guess I'm just looking if you have other advice about that.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, get on LinkedIn is my first and like, yeah, forever eternal advice. I love LinkedIn. It's my favorite social media platform, which I'm sure some people are like, LinkedIn's so boring. LinkedIn's great. So you can connect with me, follow me. I will tell you like all the other PhDs on there who are all like, if some of them are career coaches, some of them just like post content because they want to help. But I find that PhDs really enjoy helping other PhDs because they know how much this sucks to make this career transition. So going about that with that in mind, I think like after you get on LinkedIn, yeah, I mean, I think it's just acknowledging that like people really want to help. And before I pivoted towards charging for coaching services, people would just message me all the time and be like, hey, can you like talk to me? Like, I want to make this career transition. I don't really know how. Like, do you have any advice? I met with over 100 people for free because I wanted to help. And I think acknowledging that like helping people feels good. and maybe you message 10 people and like only one person responds, but that person like really wants to help you and they can help you, and that's all that networking is at the end of the day. My other piece of advice is to just build your network before you need it. I see a lot of people who they are only on LinkedIn when they're looking for a job, and then once they have a job they leave LinkedIn and they're not like building their network. And I think I can tell, and like other people can tell. I'm like, I can tell when you're just talking to me because you want me to give you a job, as opposed to, oh, you genuinely like want to learn about my career trajectory and you're interested in my advice. I have people who are like, can you give me a referral? Can you review a resume? Like, can you do something for me? And it's usually strangers. And at that point, I'm just like, my time isn't free, and I would like love to help, but I can't. So I think when you go in with this mindset of I just really want to learn from this person, and I like, if they don't give me a job, like if they don't have an opportunity for me, like that doesn't matter. I just like I really want to learn from this person. I think that's the big mindset shift. Just treat it as like making friends. And you can practice mock informational interviews, or just, I guess not mock, but like actual informational interviews with people. So like a couple weeks ago, I was like getting my hair cut, and the person cutting my hair was telling me like, oh, I'm moving salons, like I just got a new job. And it turned into an informational interview where I was just like, oh, it's like really cool. Like, how did you get your job? I'm like, how do you get promoted in the hair industry? Like, how is your prices? And I was sitting there, I'm like, this turned into like an informational interview, which is really funny, but I was just like genuinely curious because I knew nothing about any of that. And so I've actually started doing this like every time my friends start talking about their careers. I'm just like, so like, how did you get into software engineering? And like, you've been at this company for a while. Like, do you think that you'll pivot? And just like chatting with people who like you don't expect them to give you a job, I think cultivates this like this curiosity that you have to have about when you're like chatting with other people. But it is hard. I had someone message me today about, you know, how can you like how does a neurodivergent introvert with social anxiety network, and it seems like we're doomed to fail. And I'm like, I deeply understand this. As someone who had like really like I'm talking to like a room of people now, but as someone who had like pretty crippling social anxiety for most of my life, the only thing that helped was just forcing myself to interact with people over and over and over again until it got easier, which really sucks. But that's just, networking is a skill, just like everything else, and you just have to practice it. So it's going to feel weird, but I think also just some acknowledgement that networking is what you have to do to get a job. I would not have my job right now if I didn't network. It just would not. I didn't even know about my company. So
Anybody else? I have one final question.
yeah.
In lieu of anybody else asking questions. So we heard from Dr. Nicole Betts earlier
Mhm.
today, which I believe you
Yeah,
know
we know
her.
each other.
And she mentioned about LinkedIn and how it can be a really great tool for academic PIs to be able to support their trainees
Mhm.
that want to go into industry by um, using that. And so I'm curious if you have any advice for folks that are staying in academia
Mhm.
but know they will have a large number of people they interact with that want to go into industry. How can those folks best support people with careers
Yeah.
coming into industry?
No, I as someone who like I have a coaching program right now, and so I actually like I'm experiencing this right now. So I have I because I advise people who have careers who are very different than mine. I'm like, I don't really know anything about like medical writing or instructional design or data science. And so what I've been doing is either, you know, when I see another PhD who has one of these careers, or when they send me a connection request, I just like send them I will just like send them a message and have a conversation with them, be like, hey, I'm like, your career sounds cool. Like, did you have to train, did you have to upskill? Like, do you have any resources? And at this point, I'm just like gathering information for people who I'm trying to help. So I have a better understanding of what it takes to move into these careers. And that's how I learned that, like, for instructional design, for instance, most people just pivoted and they didn't have to upskill. It was really just about reframing their academic experience. I know from my own experience with UX research, like, you really do have to upskill and gain product development experience. I recently learned today that I was talking to someone in trust and safety. Apparently, trust and safety got really hit like really hard by the layoffs. And I know someone trying to pivot, and the person I was talking to today, he's like, I have friends who have 5 years of industry experience who are having trouble finding jobs. And I'm like, well, that is good information to know. And now I can go back to the person I was working with and tell them this is not the time. So yeah, it's just like, you know, the same advice that I give to anyone like trying to network is just reaching out to people who are interesting to you, building relationships. And like I said, I find that like PhDs like really, really want to help. And my big piece of advice that I always tell people with mixed success is I always recommend posting on LinkedIn, which seems really scary. And if you're not ready to post, at least like liking people's posts and commenting on other people's posts is a really great way to chat with other people and build relationships with other people. I think the statistic is somewhere between like 1 to 3% of people post anything on LinkedIn, and maybe only like 5 to 10% of people even like or comment or do anything on the platform. And that's just a really great way to raise your visibility. And that's how I managed to gain like 35,000 followers in a year is by posting on LinkedIn. And that is how I got my job, because the hiring manager, when I started posting on LinkedIn a year ago, he sent me a connection request in January. He's like, I really like your post, like looking forward to reading the next one. I'm like, great. Hi, Jonathan. Like happy to connect. I was working at Meta, had no interest in leaving. Meta continues to do layoff after layoff. And then in May, I posted again and I was like, this sucks. Like, I don't know if I want to stay here. And then Jonathan commented on my post and he was like, well, a smaller company like might be a better fit. Like I'm hiring now. And then I just slid into his DMs and now I'm here. So like I had never heard of my company. I was not looking for human factors. I was a UX researcher. I was not looking for human factors engineering positions. I looked at the job ad and I'm like, Jonathan, I don't have experience working in medical devices. Like, I don't know if I'm qualified for this. And he's like, your experience is equivalent in academia. I'm like, sure. You're the one hiring me, sure. But yeah, like that exchange and like that interaction like never would have happened if I weren't like posting on LinkedIn in the way that I was. So I think you can post, like you can share. People love personal stories on LinkedIn. So like challenges that you've faced and how you've overcome them, or it's even just a great way to be like, this is a project that I did and like here's what I learned. And just like sharing and giving information freely to other people is a great way to network. So that's my big pitch for being active on LinkedIn. But yeah, feel free to connect with me or follow me, and yeah, you can follow along with this weird experiment that I'm doing.
Yeah, that's thank you so much for that offer. I know I
Yeah.
have a lot of work to do on my LinkedIn page. I do have one, I found out today, but
Oh.
it has a
I'm-
picture and that's about it. So
yeah, I feel like that whenever I tell people I'm like popular on LinkedIn, they're like, yeah, I think I have a LinkedIn.
mhm.
And yeah, because people only like use it when they need a job, but you should. It's great. It's a great networking platform. It's what I wish academic Twitter would move to. I think that's what academic Twitter should be on.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr.
Yeah.
Ruba, for being with us. This was great.
Yeah,
You
for
all
cool.
help me
Yeah.
in thanking her. Great. All right. So this ends our day. I will just remind you all that we do have this link. If you have feedback to provide to us, I'll send it out in an email as well. And we will send out recordings once we get those ready and available. And some of the speakers have said that they would like to share their slides. And so if they have agreed to that, then we'll also send that out as well. Otherwise, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you everyone who's online. And we'll have a safe break and new year, and we'll see you in January. I need to stop it.